The man everyone thought they knew. The bus lurched to a stop hard enough to make a few passengers glance up from their phones. "Easy there, Walt," a young man muttered with a smirk as he stepped toward the exit. "Trying to break the speed record for slowest driver in the city?" A couple of his friends chuckled. Walter Briggs gave the same response he always did, a small nod, nothing more. The folding doors sighed open. Cold rain drifted through the entrance as the passengers disappeared into the gray morning. Walter waited until the crosswalk cleared before easing the bus back into traffic. The city was barely awake. Streetlights still glowed against the wet pavement. Storefront windows reflected streaks of yellow and white across the road. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with a tired rhythm that matched the old diesel engine beneath his feet. 42 years behind the wheel had taught Walter something important. Most people only noticed a bus driver when they were annoyed. If the bus arrived safely, nobody remembered him. If it arrived 2 minutes late, everyone did. The thought didn't bother him anymore. At least, that's what he told himself. At the next stop, an elderly woman climbed aboard carrying 2 grocery bags. Before she could ask, Walter was already standing. "Let me get those." "Oh, Walter, you don't have to." "I know." He took the heavier bag and helped her reach a seat. The woman smiled. "Still taking care of everybody." Walter simply tipped his cap and returned to the driver's seat. As the route continued, the bus filled with the usual collection of commuters. Construction workers with mud on their boots, nurses finishing overnight shifts, students wearing headphones, office employees staring into glowing screens. Most barely looked at him. A few greeted him by name. Others treated him like part of the machinery, just another piece of the city that existed to keep moving. Outside, rain tapped against the glass. Inside, the heater hummed softly. The morning settled into its routine. Then something unusual happened. A loud horn echoed ahead. Traffic began slowing. Walter narrowed his eyes. 2 blocks forward, a black luxury SUV sat at an awkward angle in the middle lane. Its hazard lights flashed rapidly through the rain. Cars were piling up behind it. A man in an expensive coat stood beside the vehicle, talking angrily on his phone. Walter eased the bus to the curb. Several passengers groaned immediately. "What now? We're going to be late. Can't somebody tow the thing?" Walter watched for another moment. Then he pulled the parking brake. The familiar hiss filled the cabin. "Folks," he said quietly, "I'll be right back." Nobody paid much attention as he stepped into the rain. The executive beside the SUV looked frustrated enough to explode. The dealership promised this wouldn't happen. The man snapped into his phone. Walter walked around the vehicle once. Then again. He listened. The executive noticed him. "Can I help you?" Walter glanced toward the dashboard through the driver's window. "Maybe." The man looked him up and down. Bus uniform, rain jacket, gray hair, nothing impressive. "I've already called roadside assistance." Walter nodded. "Good idea." He leaned inside the vehicle, pressed a few buttons, listened carefully, then opened the hood. Steam drifted upward. Rain hissed against warm metal. Walter examined several components without speaking. Nearly 3 minutes passed. Finally, he pointed toward a section near the battery housing. Loose grounding connection. The executive frowned. Walter pointed again. "There." The man stared. "You can tell that just by looking?" Walter hesitated. "Not exactly." Using a small screwdriver from his pocket, he adjusted the connection and tightened a fitting. Then he stepped back. "Try it." The executive climbed inside. The engine started immediately. Smooth, quiet, perfect. The man's expression changed. Not shock, confusion. The kind that comes when reality doesn't match expectations. "How did you know that?" Walter shrugged. "Seen it before." The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Before the executive could ask another question, Walter was already walking back toward his bus. Rain drummed softly on the roof as he climbed aboard. Several passengers stared. One of the students removed his headphones. "You fixed it?" Walter sat down. "Looks that way." "You're a mechanic too?" Walter adjusted the mirror. "No." The doors closed. The route continued. Yet something about the moment lingered. Not because Walter had fixed the SUV, but because he had done it with the calm certainty of someone who understood far more than he let people see. Hours later, during his lunch break, Walter sat alone at a small table behind the transit depot. Most drivers spent lunch talking, complaining about routes, sharing stories, checking sports scores. Walter preferred silence. A thermos of coffee rested beside him. So did a worn notebook. He opened it carefully. Inside were pages filled with handwritten calculations, measurements, sketches, technical notes. Complex diagrams covered the margins. Anyone glancing at the pages would assume they belonged to an engineer, not a bus driver. A younger driver named Marcus walked past. "What are you working on?" Walter closed the notebook immediately. "Nothing important." Marcus laughed. "Everything's important to you." Walter smiled faintly, but didn't answer. When Marcus disappeared inside, Walter reopened the notebook. For several moments he studied a detailed drawing hidden between the pages. His fingers rested on the paper longer than necessary. There was history in that gesture. Memory. Regret. Something unfinished. A distant depot bell interrupted the moment. Walter closed the notebook again. Back to work, back to routine, back to being invisible. As evening approached, the rain finally stopped. The clouds broke apart just enough to let pale sunlight spill across the city. Walter completed his final route and headed home. His house sat on a quiet street near the edge of town. Small, weathered, modest, the kind of place people drove past without noticing. He parked his truck in the driveway and immediately sensed something was wrong. The garage door wasn't fully closed, only a few inches. Walter stopped walking. A chill moved through him. Slowly he approached. The garage smelled faintly of wet concrete and old machine oil. Everything appeared normal. Workbench, tool chest, shelves. Nothing seemed disturbed. Then he noticed an empty space on the highest shelf. His eyes locked onto it instantly. For a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. A long cardboard blueprint tube was gone. Not money, not tools, not electronics, only the tube. Walter stepped closer. His weathered hand touched the dusty outline where it had rested for decades. The color drained from his face. Outside, a distant train horn echoed across the darkening city. Inside the garage, Walter stood completely still. For the first time all day, the calm old bus driver looked genuinely afraid, because whoever had entered this garage hadn't been looking for valuables. They had been looking for something very specific. And somehow, after all these years, they had found it. The blueprints nobody was supposed to find. Walter barely slept. The missing blueprint tube sat in his mind like a loose bolt, rattling inside a machine. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the empty shelf in the garage. By dawn, he was already sitting at the kitchen table. A single lamp illuminated the room. The coffee beside him had gone cold. Outside, the sky was still dark. Inside, the silence felt heavier than usual. On the opposite side of the table sat an empty chair. Walter glanced at it unconsciously. For years, he had shared morning coffee there with his wife, Elaine. Even after she was gone, he never moved the chair. Some habits survived long after the reason for them disappeared. A sharp vibration interrupted his thoughts. His phone. Walter frowned. Almost nobody called him this early. He answered. "Hello? Mr. Briggs?" The voice belonged to a stranger. "Yes. My name is Daniel Mercer." Walter immediately recognized the name, the executive with the broken SUV. "What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause. "Actually, I was hoping to ask you something." Walter already knew where the conversation was heading. "You fixed my vehicle yesterday," Daniel continued. "I can't stop thinking about it." Walter sighed quietly. "It was a loose connection." "No," Daniel hesitated. "That's not what I mean." Walter remained silent. The younger man continued. "You knew exactly where to look." Outside the window, dawn slowly began turning the horizon gray. Lots of mechanics could have done the same thing. But you're not a mechanic. Walter looked toward the empty chair again. "No," he said softly. "I'm not." The conversation ended a few minutes later, yet the questions remained, and Daniel Mercer wasn't the type of person who easily let questions go unanswered. 3 days passed. Walter continued driving his route. Passengers boarded, passengers left. The city moved as it always had. But beneath the routine, something had changed. He found himself checking the mirrors more often, looking over his shoulder, watching unfamiliar cars, listening for sounds around the garage at night. The missing blueprints had awakened old memories he had spent decades trying to bury. Then another surprise arrived. During his afternoon break, Marcus approached holding a tablet. "Hey, Walt." Walter looked up. Marcus appeared unusually excited. "You seen this?" Walter shook his head. Marcus placed the tablet on the table. An online news article filled the screen. The headline immediately caught Walter's attention. A major transportation technology corporation was announcing a revolutionary new public transit safety system. His stomach tightened. He began reading. Halfway through the article, the color slowly drained from his face. The diagrams, the design concepts, the structural layout, the safety redundancies. Not identical, but close. Far too close. The company claimed the system had been developed after years of innovative research. Yet Walter recognized certain engineering solutions instantly, solutions he had drawn by hand decades earlier. Marcus noticed the change. "Walt?" Walter didn't answer. His attention remained fixed on the screen. For the first time in years, anger flickered across his face. Not explosive anger, something quieter, older, the kind that had been waiting a very long time. That evening, Daniel Mercer sat inside the City Archives building. Rain tapped softly against tall windows. Stacks of records surrounded him. At first, his curiosity about Walter had been simple. Now it had become something else, because the more he searched, the stranger the story became. A transportation historian pushed a box across the table. "This is everything we found." Daniel opened it. Old photographs, technical reports, newspaper clippings, project summaries. Most were nearly 40 years old. One photograph caught his attention immediately. A group of engineers standing beside an early transit prototype. Daniel leaned closer. There, near the back, partially hidden, younger, thinner, without gray hair, but unmistakably Walter. Daniel turned the photograph over. No name listed. He continued searching. Hours passed. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Walter appeared repeatedly. Project meetings, testing facilities, engineering reviews, field inspections. Yet somehow his name rarely appeared in official headlines. Another clipping revealed the public face of the project. A celebrated engineer who received awards, interviews, and national recognition. The newspapers called him a visionary. The archives told a different story. Many technical documents carried handwritten notes signed with a simple initial, WB, Walter Briggs. Daniel sat back slowly. Something wasn't adding up. The truth emerged gradually, like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. Years earlier, Walter had been part of a small engineering team responsible for improving transit safety systems. Not as an assistant, not as a technician, as one of the primary designers. His work had solved critical failures affecting public transportation infrastructure. The innovations eventually protected millions of passengers. Yet when corporate politics entered the picture, credit shifted elsewhere. Investors wanted charismatic leadership. Government officials wanted recognizable names. Companies wanted public figures. Walter wanted none of those things. And when the conflict intensified, he walked away, not because he lost, because he was tired. Tired of fighting people who cared more about ownership than safety. Tired of meetings. Tired of politics. Tired of watching important decisions become public relations exercises. Then life changed. Elaine became sick. Very sick. The treatments lasted years. Walter quietly abandoned opportunities that others would have considered impossible to refuse. Consulting positions, research contracts, private sector offers. One by one, he declined them all. He stayed, worked locally, drove buses, paid bills, cared for his wife. And when she eventually passed away, the world had already forgotten who he once was. Late that night, Daniel arrived at Walter's house. The garage light was on. Walter sat alone at his workbench. Old blueprints and notebooks surrounded him. The scene looked less like a hobby workshop and more like an engineering laboratory frozen in time. Daniel stood quietly for a moment, then spoke. "You designed part of it, didn't you?" Walter didn't look up. The question hung in the air. Finally he answered. "Part of what?" "The system." Walter set down a pencil. His expression remained calm, but his eyes revealed exhaustion. The past. Daniel stepped closer. "Why didn't anyone know?" A faint smile crossed Walter's face. Not a happy smile. A weary one. People knew. He folded a yellowed document carefully. They just stopped caring. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Outside, wind rattled the garage door. Daniel glanced around the workshop. Blueprints, calculations, models, decades of knowledge hidden in plain sight. Someone stole those plans, didn't they? Walter finally met his eyes. Yes. You think it was connected? Walter's silence provided the answer. The realization settled heavily between them. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't curiosity. Someone had searched specifically for those documents. And now a corporation was unveiling technology that looked disturbingly familiar. Daniel looked toward the scattered papers. Are you going to fight this? Walter leaned back slowly. The overhead light cast long shadows across the garage. For a moment he looked every bit of his age. Not because he lacked strength, because he carried decades of disappointment. I don't know. It was the most honest answer he could give. Daniel nodded. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down. A notification from a major news outlet. The transportation company had officially announced a public demonstration of its new safety technology, scheduled for the following week. Walter noticed the headline. His eyes settled on the accompanying diagram. The same design elements, the same architecture, the same fingerprints. A long silence filled the garage. Then Walter quietly reached into a drawer. From beneath a stack of notebooks, he removed an old project binder. Dust drifted into the air. The cover carried a faded date from 40 years earlier. For the first time since the theft, determination appeared behind his eyes. Not anger, not revenge, something stronger. The desire to protect the truth. And somewhere beyond the garage walls, people were preparing to take credit for a lifetime of work they never understood. The battle Walter had walked away from decades ago was coming back, whether he wanted it or not. The last route. The story spread faster than Walter expected, not through television interviews, not through viral videos, and not through dramatic public accusations. It moved the way many important stories do, quietly, one conversation at a time. A retired mechanic told an old colleague. An engineer shared a photograph. A former transit supervisor found forgotten project documents in storage. Then another, and another. Pieces of the past began surfacing from places nobody had looked in years. Walter watched it happen from a distance. Most evenings, he still drove home after work, parked his truck in the driveway, and sat for a few minutes before going inside. The attention made him uncomfortable. For decades he had lived without recognition. Now strangers suddenly wanted answers. Some wanted interviews. Others wanted statements. A few wanted headlines. Walter wanted none of it. One evening he stood in his garage studying the old binder he had retrieved from the drawer. The pages were worn, corners folded, margins covered in handwritten notes. Across dozens of diagrams appeared the same initials, WB. Proof existed. More than enough. Because proving something and reliving it were not the same thing. The past carried weight, and some memories hurt to pick up again. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel Mercer stepped inside. Behind him stood 3 older men. Walter recognized them immediately. The years had changed their faces, but not enough. Frank Delaney, Luis Ortega, Samir Hassan, engineers from the original project team. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Frank laughed softly. Still keeping everything organized, I see. Walter shook his head. No. He looked around the cluttered workshop. Actually, not really. The men smiled. The tension eased. Coffee was poured. Old stories surfaced. For the first time in decades, the team sat together again. As the evening progressed, something became increasingly clear. Walter had never been alone. Others remembered exactly what happened. Others had witnessed the decisions, the credit transfers, the political maneuvering, the public narratives that gradually erased certain names while elevating others. Frank finally placed a folder on the workbench. We found more. Walter opened it. Inside were meeting records, signed reports, project reviews, original engineering approvals. His eyes moved slowly across the pages. The evidence was undeniable. Luis leaned forward. You know what bothers me? Walter looked up. Luis pointed toward one of the documents. They never stole the work. The garage grew quiet. They stole the story. Nobody argued, because everybody understood the difference. The work still existed. Millions of people had benefited from it. The safety systems had protected lives for decades. What disappeared was the truth about who built them. And perhaps that loss was harder to accept. The Transportation Corporation's public demonstration took place 6 days later. Industry leaders filled the auditorium, investors arrived, media crews prepared cameras, large screens displayed polished presentations, celebrating innovation and progress. The company's chief executive stood confidently on stage. He spoke about vision, leadership, breakthrough thinking, the future. The audience listened politely. Then the questions began. At first they were ordinary: technical specifications, testing procedures, deployment timelines. But gradually the tone shifted. Journalists had seen the emerging reports. Historians had started comparing records. Former employees had begun speaking publicly. The discrepancies were becoming difficult to ignore. One reporter stood. "Can you explain the similarities between your new safety architecture and designs developed during the municipal transit modernization project 40 years ago?" The executive paused, only briefly, but long enough. Another question followed, then another. The atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, not explosively, simply enough for everyone to notice. By the end of the event, the conversation was no longer centered on the company's announcement. It was centered on its origins. And somewhere across town, Walter watched none of it. Instead, he sat alone on a bench overlooking a bus depot. Engines rumbled in the distance. Drivers prepared routes. Mechanics moved between service bays. The evening sun reflected off rows of windshields. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages, updates, news alerts. Walter ignored them. A young apprentice mechanic named Ethan approached. Walter had seen him around the depot for months. Hard-working kid, always asking questions, always eager to learn. Ethan sat beside him. For a while neither spoke. Finally the young man said, "They're talking about you everywhere." Walter smiled faintly. "That sounds exhausting." Ethan laughed, then grew serious. "Can I ask you something?" Walter nodded. "If all of that happened, why did you stay here?" The question lingered. Walter looked across the depot, at the buses, the drivers, the workers, the ordinary people beginning another shift. "My wife got sick." Ethan listened quietly. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the depot. Then someday turned into years. The young mechanic nodded. He understood more than Walter expected. After a moment, Ethan spoke again. "Do you regret it?" Walter considered the question carefully. For years he might have answered yes. Now he wasn't so sure. He thought about Elaine, about the routes he had driven, the people he had helped, the friendships, the lives touched in small ways, the work itself. "No," he said finally. "Some things matter more than recognition." The words surprised even him, because for the first time, he genuinely believed them. Several months later, winter arrived. Snow dusted rooftops across the city. The air carried the sharp bite of cold mornings. Walter's retirement day arrived quietly, exactly how he wanted it. No speeches, no television cameras, just another route, one final route. He arrived before sunrise. The depot lights glowed against the darkness. Inside the driver's lounge, co-workers greeted him warmly. A few handshakes lasted longer than usual. A few smiles carried unspoken emotion. Walter thanked them and headed toward his bus. The same route, the same vehicle, the same city. One last time. Passengers boarded throughout the morning. Some recognized the significance of the day. Others didn't. That was fine. The city continued moving, as cities always do. Near the end of the route, Ethan climbed aboard carrying something wrapped in brown paper. Without a word, he placed it behind Walter's seat, then sat down. Walter continued driving. Only when the bus reached the final stop did he unwrap the package. Inside was a beautifully restored copy of the original blueprint, framed behind protective glass. Beneath it sat a small engraved plaque. It read, "Designed to protect people, built by those who cared enough to stay." Walter stared at the words. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Outside, snowflakes drifted through pale morning sunlight. Passengers exited quietly. The bus gradually emptied. Eventually only Walter remained. He looked once more at the blueprint, then at the city beyond the windshield. Thousands of people moving through their lives. Most would never know his name, and somehow that no longer mattered, because the true measure of his life had never been awards, or headlines, or recognition. It was the countless strangers who arrived home safely because he had done his job well. Walter settled into the driver's seat one final time, started the engine, and guided the bus back toward the depot. As he passed through the waking city, a gentle smile appeared on his face. Not the smile of a man who had won. The smile of a man who had finally made peace with being seen. And hidden within the movement of every bus, every passenger, every ordinary day that followed, the legacy of Walter Briggs continued forward, quiet, steady, and impossible to erase. What remained after he left? 3 months after Walter Briggs retired, the city adjusted surprisingly quickly. Routes continued. Schedules changed. New drivers took old assignments. Morning commuters rushed toward work exactly as they always had. From the outside, nothing seemed different. But certain absences are felt most strongly by the people who never expected to notice them. Every morning at 6:12, an elderly woman named Margaret still arrived at stop 14, carrying 2 grocery bags. For years, Walter had helped her board before she even asked. Now she instinctively paused beside the door, waiting for a familiar voice that never came. The new drivers were polite, professional, helpful, but routines built over decades are difficult to replace. One rainy morning, Margaret sat near the front of the bus and quietly said to the driver, "Walter always remembered which knee hurt." The driver smiled. "I heard he remembered everybody." Margaret looked out the window. "That's because he paid attention." The comment lingered long after she left the bus. At the depot, Ethan discovered something unexpected. Retirement hadn't completely removed Walter from daily conversations. In fact, people seemed to mention him more often than before. Mechanics told stories. Drivers shared memories. Dispatchers recalled small acts of kindness nobody had noticed at the time. The stories rarely involved engineering achievements, or blueprints, or public recognition. Instead, they focused on ordinary moments. The night Walter stayed 3 hours past his shift to help a stranded family, the winter storm when he personally checked every disabled passenger, reached home safely. The years he spent mentoring new drivers without ever asking for credit. Ethan gradually realized something important. People respected Walter because of his intelligence, but they loved him because of his character. The difference mattered. One afternoon, a package arrived at the Transit Authority headquarters. No return address, no publicity announcement, just a large wooden crate. Inside sat dozens of carefully organized binders, engineering notes, design sketches, research observations, technical solutions. 40 years of accumulated knowledge. Attached to the first binder was a handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Walter. The note read, "If any of this helps someone solve a problem, it's theirs to use. Nothing more. No signature, no explanation, no mention of awards." The Transit Authority eventually donated the collection to a public engineering archive. Within months, university students began studying the material. Young engineers referenced his notes. Researchers cited his work. The knowledge continued traveling forward, exactly as Walter would have wanted. Daniel Mercer found himself thinking about Walter more often than expected. The experience had changed him. Before meeting the old bus driver, Daniel measured success in visible achievements. Promotions, recognition, influence, growth, the usual things ambitious people chase. Walter had complicated that definition. One evening, Daniel attended a transportation conference. Industry leaders filled the room. Executives exchanged business cards. Speakers discussed innovation. At one point, a presenter displayed a slide highlighting the historical contributors who shaped modern transit safety systems. For the first time, Walter Briggs's name appeared among them. The acknowledgement lasted less than 30 seconds. Most attendees probably forgot it immediately, yet Daniel found himself smiling, because Walter would have considered 30 seconds more than enough. Spring arrived. Snow disappeared. Trees along city streets slowly turned green. Life moved forward. One Saturday morning, Ethan drove to Walter's house. He hadn't visited in several weeks. The old truck remained parked in the driveway. The garage door stood open. Inside, Walter sat at his workbench, exactly where Ethan expected to find him. The workshop looked cleaner now, more organized. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows. The atmosphere felt lighter somehow. Retirement suited him. "Morning," Ethan said. Walter glanced up. "You're early. You taught me that's when the useful work gets done." Walter laughed. The sound surprised both of them. Over the years, he had become someone who smiled more than he laughed. The two spent the morning working on a restoration project. an old transit control system from the 1980s. Most people would have considered it junk. Walter considered it history. As they worked, Ethan asked questions. Walter answered, sometimes directly, sometimes with another question, the way good teachers often do. Hours passed without either noticing. At lunchtime, Ethan finally set down a wrench. You know, he said, people still talk about what happened. Walter continued tightening a bolt. They'll stop eventually. Maybe. Ethan paused, but I don't think they'll forget. Walter didn't respond immediately. The workshop filled with the sounds of distant birds and softly turning tools. Finally, he said, that's not really up to me. No, Ethan nodded. It isn't. For a moment, both men continued working in comfortable silence. Then Ethan added, but I think that's what legacy actually is. Walter looked at him. Ethan gestured around the workshop. The things that keep helping people after you're done. The old engineer considered the statement. Years earlier, he might have argued. Today, he simply nodded. That autumn, the city unveiled a small exhibit inside the Transit Museum. Nothing extravagant. A few photographs, historical documents, original design sketches. Among them stood the framed blueprint Ethan had restored. Visitors passed through every day. Some stopped, some didn't. Children occasionally asked questions. Parents occasionally read the descriptions aloud. Life went on. One afternoon, Walter visited quietly, alone. He walked through the exhibit without announcing who he was. Nobody recognized him, and that was perfectly fine. He stopped in front of the blueprint. For several minutes, he simply stood there, watching strangers study the work, watching families move from display to display, watching history become part of something larger than himself. It was about everyone who had contributed, everyone who had built, repaired, maintained, and protected systems that millions relied upon. The forgotten workers, the overlooked problem solvers, the people whose names rarely appeared in headlines. Walter understood that better than anyone. As he turned to leave, a young boy looked up at the blueprint and asked his father, "Who made that?" The father glanced at the plaque, then answered honestly, "A lot of people, I think." Walter smiled, because that answer was closer to the truth than any award or title could ever be. He stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. Buses moved steadily through the city. Passengers boarded. Drivers followed their routes. Life continued, and somewhere within that constant motion, the work of countless unseen hands carried on, including his own, not forgotten, not famous, simply part of the road ahead.